But Calvin's work in Geneva was not without challenges. He faced opposition from all kinds of factions, most notably the Libertines. And these were a very kind of wealthy people, Geneva's elite, political elite, socialites, if you will. And they believed very much in personal freedom, and they fought very hard to protect their social status and privileges. They weren't necessarily opposed to religion, but they didn't want the church to enforce moral discipline in ways that would impact their private life. And one of the most significant ways that Calvin sought to enforce this discipline, this idea of discipline, was through the proper administration of the sacraments, and particularly the Lord's Supper. See, he believed that the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was a sacred act meant only for those who've repented from their sins and have sought or seeking to live a godly life. Calvin, and I think rightly, understood that allowing unrepentant sinners to partake in the Lord's Supper would be a desecration of the sacrament and an affront to God's holiness. By 1553, these libertines that were real opposed to Calvin's moral standards had really reached a boiling point. Some members of the Libertine faction had been accused of some very serious moral failings very publicly, including sexual immorality, scandalous behavior. There's all kinds of stuff. And these accusations, despite this, these libertines, because of who they were, of prominence and wealth, they expected to be allowed to partake in the Lord's Supper during the Easter service. And again, you have to remember that the church and the government are very much interwoven at this point in time. And Calvin was adamant that they shouldn't relieve the sacrament unless they've repented and submitted to church discipline. But the libertines, they had political influence, and they were outraged by Calvin's refusal to allow them to the Lord's Supper. They believed that their societal position, their politics, their status in society gave them the right to partake in the sacraments, regardless of moral conduct. And they challenged Calvin's authority here. They really pushed on it, and they made it clear that they expected to receive communion as a demonstration of their power over him and the church. So as the story goes, on Easter Sunday of 1553, the libertines showed up to St. Pierre Cathedral in Geneva, and they were determined to publicly defy Calvin and take the Lord's Supper, just to assert their will. And as the story goes, they entered the church with a group of armed men. So these are armed men. I'm sure they've got like swords and stuff showing up. Now, Calvin was clearly, he's aware of what's going on, but fully aware of it, he went to the pulpit and he preached. And he knew that refusing the Lord's Supper to these group of libertines could really lead to violence in the church or even his own expulsion from Geneva. But he was unwavering in his convictions. And during the service, Calvin, as it's said, that he spoke with great intensity. He addressed the seriousness of the sacrament, the need for true repentance before coming to the Lord's table. And when the moment came to serve the bread and wine, the armed group of libertines moved forward, expecting to receive communion. Calvin, however, stepped down from the pulpit. He stood before the communion table, and as the story goes, with unwavering resolve, he spread his arms out over the elements of the Lord's table, physically blocking them from access to the bread and wine. He put it over it, and he declared, quote, "These hands you may crush, these arms you may lop off. My life you may take, my blood is yours, you may shed it, but you shall never force me to give holy things to the profane and dishonor the table of my God." The congregation, as you can imagine, was just stunned by this. They were shocked. They were stunned by Calvin's courage. And in the face of violence, Calvin stood firm, refusing to let the sacraments of the Lord's table be dishonored. And by God's grace, rather than incite a riot, they withdrew, and Calvin's authority in the church was preserved.